Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is always the same. We take the densest concepts, the historical arguments that underlie modern life, and we grind them down into knowledge nuggets so you can get quickly and thoroughly informed. Today, we're going straight to the philosophical bedrock, the foundation of how we know, and maybe more importantly, how we should behave in the world, particularly when we are trying to study it.
And this is a foundational discussion that, often gets skipped. It just sounds so abstract, but it dictates everything from, say, university funding decisions all the way to how we interpret a research participant's life story. We are unpacking what is really a worldview war raging within research ethics. It's this deep structural conflict between the Enlightenment's ethics of rationalism and a compelling, really essential alternative that we're calling the ethics of being.
That sounds incredibly heavy. And here's why it should matter to you, regardless of whether you've ever filled out a consent form. Our source material argues that if we want to fix the moral problems we see in modern inquiry, things like institutional bias or extractive research practices or failing to protect vulnerable populations, well, simply adjusting our methodology just isn't enough. We have to tackle the root problem, what the sources call the Enlightenment mind and its progeny. So it's a systemic critique, not just some methodological tweak.
It's about challenging the operating system itself.
Right.
We often treat ethical principles as these formal procedural rules, like a safety checklist or neat little syllogisms we can follow to ensure compliance. But the problem, as our source material lays out, is that this procedural approach, which is rooted so deeply in Enlightenment rationalism, it has a very clear and, frankly, a very damaging intellectual history. It inevitably leads us down a path toward means-ends utilitarianism and eventually the moral chaos of philosophical relativism, which you could argue has been modernity's great intellectual failure.
Okay, so the stakes are critical. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand that historical trajectory. How Western thought went from seeking this absolute context-free rationalism to, well, potentially landing us in a state of moral chaos. Where, if we can't agree on what's true, we certainly can't agree on what is good.
Exactly. We need to trace that history, understand why the rationalist project failed to deliver a sustainable moral order, and then discover the alternative path forward through this idea of the ethics of being. And the key insight here, for researchers in particular, is recognizing that qualitative research has already made a huge intellectual leap. It's made an interpretive turn away from the demands of rigid scientific modernity. So this deep dive is really exploring the necessary, and I would say long overdue, accompanying moral and political shift. You can't interpret the world critically and contextually while at the same time maintaining an ethics system built by the very scientific modernity you're critiquing.
So it's time to change the philosophical foundation, not just the paint job.
Okay, let's unpack this legacy, starting with the core philosophical split that the Enlightenment established. Intellectual history often describes this split using those classic dualisms: subject versus object, fact versus value, material versus spiritual. But our source material suggests those are just, secondary symptoms. It pushes us deeper into the source code.
Right. The source code, as you put it, it's more subtle than those three dichotomies we inherited from, Galileo, Descartes, and Newton. Those are legitimate interpretations of the cosmology that resulted, yes, but they don't quite capture the sharpest philosophical focus. Our sources argue that the deepest root of the Enlightenment mind was the establishment of pervasive autonomy, which they actually label the cult of human personality. Pervasive autonomy? That sounds empowering, but also potentially destabilizing. It's the radical idea that the human being was declared a law unto themselves. So they were set loose from every traditional external authority, the feudal economic order, the religious mandates of the church, or even the constraints imposed by nature itself.
And this freedom motif became this massive driving force right after the Renaissance. The individual gained this profound, almost proud self-consciousness of their own sovereignty. The 18th century mind began viewing nature not as some divinely ordered reality, but as an arena of limitless possibilities where human reason was the master. That release, especially from the constraints of nature, spawned these autonomous individuals who considered themselves independent of any binding authority other than their own rational will.
And what gave this philosophical idea, this radical freedom, its immediate and undeniable power? It had to be the achievements in natural science, right? They provided the empirical evidence that autonomy wasn't just some hopeful philosophy. It was a proven capability.
Absolutely. When you look at the breakthroughs in mathematics, physics, astronomy, Galileo charting the heavens, Newton defining the laws of motion, they demonstrated this undeniable proof that human reason could dominate nature and describe reality with stunning predictive power.
And the sources cite a really profound implication here. Science showed that by applying reason to nature and even to human beings, people could live progressively happier lives.
Think about the shift in how we treat social issues. The sources use the examples of crime and insanity. In previous eras, these often required these heavy-handed, repressive theological explanations, possession, sin, moral failure. During the Enlightenment, they were suddenly deemed capable of mundane, empirical solutions, social reform, psychological treatment, things like that. Science made human mastery of the world seem real, tangible, and achievable without any reference to metaphysical commands. It inflated the self-confidence of the individual.
Okay, so we have this wildly autonomous individual, empowered by science. But that immediately creates a tension with the moral world. How do you maintain both universal morality and radical individual freedom at the same time? The Enlightenment solved this by, well, pushing values to the fringe, creating that radical fact-value disjunction.
Yes. They established what they called a radical discontinuity between knowledge of what is, the hard empirical facts, and knowledge of what ought to be, the subjective, often conflicting, values. This is where the stranglehold of factuality really takes hold. To secure the authority of what is, they had to sideline what ought to be.
And we see this institutionalized so early on. You take Robert Hooke, helping to establish London's Royal Society 3 centuries ago.
Right.
The mandate was completely explicit. The society would eschew any discussion of religion, rhetoric, morals, and politics.
And that's a crucial historical marker. Those regions of human interest that implied oughts or constraints or imperatives, they were deemed irrelevant to serious scientific inquiry. Science was focused on objective mechanism, morality, politics, aesthetics. Those became matters of subjective taste and opinion, not rational resolution.
And this autonomy doctrine, which insists on total freedom, created what the source material calls the greatest mischief. If every individual is sovereign, how on earth do you integrate human freedom with moral order?
Well, the Enlightenment thinkers, they were reacting so powerfully against the constraints of despotic political regimes and oppressive church systems. So they chose a really uncompromising stance for freedom. They categorically insisted on autonomy first. And to do that, they began with the assumption that human liberty ought to be cut away from the moral order, never integrated meaningfully with it. They didn't resolve the complex relationship. They just severed it entirely. And this severance leaves a permanent hole in the foundations of rationalist ethics.
And the most outspoken and maybe the most terrifying advocate of this radical freedom was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who represented the romantic wing of the Enlightenment.
Rousseau gave intellectual substance to this idea of free self-determination as the highest good. He promoted a freedom of breathtaking scope, not just freedom from a monarch or the church, but freedom from culture and any authority whatsoever that had not been freely chosen by the individual. His entire philosophy centers the individual's will as the core of existence.
I'm trying to picture that level of freedom. It sounds anarchic. If he really cut freedom away from culture and all authority, how did he expect society to function without just instantly collapsing?
He recognized the philosophical consequences of this scope of freedom more astutely than others who were, comfortable with a more limited negative freedom, like Locke. Rousseau's entire solution rested on an act of faith. He presumed a noble human nature. He believed that this naturally good human nature would use freedom beneficently and therefore live compatibly with a moral order that was somehow inherent to the self. And this optimistic faith in the essential goodness of the radically free self is absolutely crucial to understanding the entire shaky trajectory of the ethics of rationalism. It all hinges on the idea that autonomous individuals will just naturally choose the common good.
So rationalism built this massive intellectual house based on a critical dualism. Facts are real, values are subjective, and then gave the key to the individual, just hoping they'd use their radical autonomy for good. That really sets the stage for how the social sciences developed. Moving into the 19th century, then, we see this philosophical blueprint being applied directly. The social sciences, the original moral sciences like sociology, political science, psychology, they're often analyzed in terms of their methodological debates. But the source material insists the real story is their inscription into the dominant Enlightenment worldview.
That's exactly right. The social sciences and the liberal state emerged at the same time. conceived as these symbiotic systems designed to support and enable the autonomous, free citizenry championed by thinkers like Mill. They weren't just researching society, they were designing the knowledge base for a free society.
And what does that design mandate? It requires institutions to ensure neutrality between different conceptions of the good. The state could no longer insist on citizens adhering to a single religious tradition or a single family form or even a single definition of artistic value.
This institutional design was, a practical necessity. In a diverse post-Reformation society, those deeply entrenched shared conceptions of the good were no longer universal. So insisting on a single ideal or taking sides on fundamental moral issues was seen as counterproductive and authoritarian. Therefore, value neutrality appeared to be the logical, the practical alternative for a society whose members practiced many religions and customs. It was an intellectual compromise that preserved political peace.
And now we get to John Stuart Mill, the titan who truly cemented this philosophy into the methodology of the social sciences. His foundational principle is the supremacy of autonomous subjectivity, which established both the foundations of inductive inquiry and the rationale for the liberal state.
And this takes us directly to his means-ends dualism, which is really the operational principle of value neutrality. For Mill, neutrality is necessary to promote autonomy because freedom of choice is the highest good. If you force me to choose well, you have robbed me of my individuality and my right to define my own happiness.
He had that famous quote that really summarizes the whole mindset. It's better for citizens to choose badly than to be forced to choose well.
That statement is the core of classical liberalism and utilitarian ethics. Planning our lives according to our own ideas and purposes is the sine qua non for autonomous beings because, and I'm quoting here, the free development of individuality is one of the principal ingredients of human happiness. So if the individual defines the happy life, the end, then science's role must be strictly relegated to defining the means.
So science provides the know-how, the data, the predictive capability, while the autonomous citizens and their politicians articulate the moral and political ends. The separation feels neat, but it essentially kicks morality right out of the scientific laboratory.
It does. Mill's neutrality, rooted in individual autonomy, is the axis of his major works, including utilitarianism and his system of logic. His utilitarian principle demands that the individual enjoy full liberty, except, of course, the liberty to harm others. But critically, in his logic of inquiry, he sought to perfect Francis Bacon's inductive techniques specifically to replace Aristotelian deductive logic.
This is a major philosophical turning point. Mill argued that syllogism's deductive logic contribute nothing new to human knowledge. Can you explain that radical dismissal?
Sure. If you start with a general premise like all men are mortal and you conclude, therefore, the Duke of Wellington is mortal, you haven't really learned anything that wasn't already contained in the premise. The conclusion is just a reordering of the conceptual world. And Mill lived in an age obsessed with industrial and scientific progress. The crucial issue wasn't reordering ideas, it was discriminating genuine knowledge, the kind that improves life from superstition.
So to pursue genuine, useful truth, you have to generalize and synthesize, inductively moving from the known observable facts to the unknown predictive generalization.
And this is where we have to pause and detail his famous contribution to method. Mill established 4 canonical modes of experimental inquiry, which every researcher, even today, implicitly uses. They are the methods of agreement, disagreement, residues, and concomitant variations.
Let's make sure we unpack those because they really define the operational logic of the social scientist who claims neutrality. What exactly are these modes designed to do?
They're mechanisms for establishing causal relationships based purely on empirical observation, assuming nature is structured by predictable uniformities. The method of agreement says, if 2 or more instances of a phenomenon share only one circumstance, that circumstance is likely the cause or part of the cause.
For example, if 10 people eat at a restaurant and only the 3 who ordered the salmon get sick, the salmon is the probable cause because that's the only point of agreement.
Precisely. The method of difference or disagreement is the inverse. If an instance where the phenomenon occurs and an instance where it does not occur have every circumstance in common except one, that one differing circumstance is the cause.
So 2 groups are identical, but one receives a drug and the other a placebo. If the drug group improves and the placebo group doesn't, the drug is the difference and therefore the cause. This is the foundation of experimental research design.
Then you have the method of residues, which says that if you identify known causes for a complex effect and subtract them, whatever remains must be the result of a residual unknown cause. And finally, concomitant variation states that if one phenomenon varies in a consistent pattern with another, they are causally connected. This is the basis of all correlation and regression analysis.
It's so clear these are all mechanisms for establishing facts and means. They are completely blind to the question of whether that knowledge ought to be pursued or ought to be used for a certain end.
And that leads directly to Mill's positivism. Echoing Auguste Comte, Mill defined matter as the permanent possibility of sensation. So only the facts of sense phenomena exist. Metaphysical substances are not real. Therefore, social research must be amoral, limited strictly to factual data, yielding only practical benefits.
This means scientific protocol should be prescriptive only against bad science, meaning, faulty induction or poor data, but explicitly not against bad conduct.
Correct. Research can only be judged true or false, not right or wrong, because science is inherently political only in its applications. And this disinterested stance, Mill argued, advocates neutrality out of a genuine concern for the autonomy of the individuals social science serves, treating them as thinking, willing agents responsible for their own choices.
So Mill successfully carved morality out of science. But didn't he leave a huge hole where practical decision-making should be? How did Max Weber try to patch that while still maintaining this idea of neutrality?
That's a perfect transition. Because Mill provided the methodology for the liberal state, Weber provided the political and professional rationale for the academic, and Weber's freedom-value-relevance distinction. It remains canonical for 21st century social science. It's often invoked when mainstream social scientists contend that ethics or politics is not their business.
Right. So Weber's model unconditionally separates empirical facts from politics, appealing to the rationality of scientific evidence for knowledge that is morally neutral. But he introduced a necessary nuance that Mill kind of overlooked, the difference between value relevance and value freedom.
Yes, value relevance applies to the discovery phase. Weber was too sophisticated to claim that scientists were robots. He recognized that personal, cultural, or moral values cannot be eliminated when choosing a subject. They determine what social scientists deem worthy of investigation, the scientific interest.
So if I decide to study systemic poverty in Appalachia, that choice is inherently value relevant. I believe poverty is significant and worth analyzing. The analysis is meaningless without that underlying evaluative idea.
Exactly. The stimulus to posing scientific problems is always given by practical questions rooted in the investigator's conviction regarding the significance of particular cultural facts. However, the hard line comes with value freedom, which applies to the presentation and analysis phase. This is the famous mandate that professors should hang up their values along with their coats when entering the lecture hall or publishing their findings.
So findings must not express any moral or political judgments of desirability or undesirability. Weber expected the scientist to be a detached observer, delivering facts, and leaving the judgment of the ought to the politician or the private citizen.
And we have to understand that this was partly driven by very practical circumstances in the Prussian universities of the time. Academic freedom was precarious. With hiring and funding controlled by political officials, faculty were more likely to maintain their autonomy if they strictly refrained from policy commitments and political criticism in their official capacity. It was a strategy for self-preservation.
A political move disguised as a philosophical one. And he also thought that training a managerial class that was learned about means and silent about ends was the best way to increase Germany's power and prosperity in a rapidly industrializing age.
And this just reinforces the Enlightenment dichotomy. While Weber wasn't a positivist like Comte, he absolutely appeals to empirical evidence and logical reasoning rooted in human rationality. He insists that, and this is a quote, "the validity of a practical imperative as a norm and the truth value of an empirical proposition are absolutely heterogeneous in character. They exist in separate universes."
So if the validity of a moral command and the truth value of a fact are completely different, then science can generate a language of science that excludes all rules or directions for conduct.
Scientific knowledge exists for its own sake as morally neutral. And this reinforces autonomy because both Mill and Weber agreed on one critical point. Neutrality is desirable because questions of value are not rationally resolvable. Since we cannot rationally prove that one end like happiness or justice or wealth is better than another, science must stay silent on the matter to protect individual freedom. That is the perfect logical expression of the ethics of rationalism.
So that magnificent intellectual edifice built on rational autonomy, the means-ends dualism, and value neutrality became what the sources call modernity's formidable juggernaut. It drove industrialization, the liberal state, bureaucratic institutions, and global capitalism. But the sources suggest this system is now in historic disrepute and turmoil. What went wrong?
Well, the crisis is acute because the heart and soul of modernity is that million autonomous self-possessed, self-sufficient, essentially purposeless, and detached from social context. When you abstract the individual away from their history, their culture, their community, you are left with a detached self that leaves moral issues strident and unresolved. Debates about foundational values become interminable. They're reduced merely to rhetorical persuasion or a performance of indignation.
The source material defines this crisis as the disenchantment of the world. We lost that sense of ultimate meaning and we replace it with mechanism.
Yes, disenchantment. It's reflected in things like Kierkegaard's irony, the inability to find ultimate purpose, or Hannah Arendt's analysis of the amorality of bureaucratic reason, where the only goal is efficiency over morality. The individual is reduced to a functionary. If the system is working efficiently, no one feels personally, morally responsible for the outcome, no matter how catastrophic.
And without a generally agreed upon, non-debatable definition of human dignity, the value of human life itself becomes debatable rather than stable. Modernity's promise of universal progress and rational order it feels broken. And that leads to a deep dissatisfaction with its culture. Secularism, hyper-individual rights, utilitarian ethics, and imperial politics.
And it's important to understand the trajectory here. Before the system shattered into relativism, rationalism reached its absolute cold peak with Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century. He was the most uncompromising attempt to base morality purely on logic.
Kant's deontological rationalism. He fully assimilated ethics into Cartesian logic. I mean, he was saturated with Descartes and Newtonian science and demanded that moral laws, the ethical analog of the unchanging laws of physics, must be universally applicable and free from inner contradiction.
This is his famous categorical imperative. Moral principles were derived not from custom or emotion or consequence, but from disembodied reason, the essential structure of human nature. You should only act in such a way that you could simultaneously will your action to become a universal law.
Wait, that sounds morally impossible in practice. Are you saying the source argues that prioritizing context-free logic over immediate human welfare is the peak of rationalism's coldness?
Absolutely. For Kant, moral absolutism means that certain actions are inherently and always wrong, regardless of context, consequence, or intention. The classic example is lying. For Kant, lying is immoral, period. It destroys the very foundation of reason and trust.
But let's take a practical, non-academic scenario. If a friend is hiding in your house and a murderer knocks on your door and asks if your friend is inside, Kantian logic demands you tell the truth. That seems to elevate a logical principle consistency above the immediate, obvious moral imperative of saving a life.
It does. And that's why Kantian ethics, while rigorously logical, felt abstract and cold to many philosophers who followed. It sustained the Enlightenment subjectivism, the idea that the self contains the moral structure, discoverable through pure reason. But it detached that morality so completely from context, love, or consequence that it became brittle and ultimately unsustainable for many.
And once that structure proved too brittle, what replaced it? Once the absolute certainty collapsed, philosophical relativism rushed into the vacuum, destroying the intellectual credibility of the modernist paradigm.
We can trace the initial intellectual struggle back to David Hume in the 18th century, who was an early detractor of the Enlightenment idea that common morality was known to all rational beings.
Yeah.
As a British empiricist, Hume insisted that humans know only what they experience directly, and reason is limited to calculating facts.
And this led him to argue that morality is based not on abstract principles or cognition, but profoundly on emotion and desire, feelings of approval or disapproval.
He stated famously that reason is utterly impotent to produce or prevent actions. Reason can calculate facts and social impact, the means, but it cannot on its own judge whether something is virtuous or malevolent. That judgment belongs to our feelings. Hume really initiated the struggle by locating value in subjectivity, which paved the way for the total collapse.
But it was Friedrich Nietzsche who made relativism inescapable for the 20th century. Following his famous declaration of the death of God, Nietzsche advocated a total rejection of traditional moral values, arguing we face the demise of moral interpretation altogether.
For Nietzsche, morality was a world of deception, delusion, error, interpretation. Since everything lacked transcendental meaning in a godless world, morality became a fool's paradise, used by the weak to control the strong.
He didn't just reject ethics, he actually replaced it. He argued for aesthetic values instead.
Yes. His most profound assertion was that only as aesthetic phenomena are life and the world justified. Ethics, he argued, requires a supernatural sanction that no longer exists. Aesthetics needs none. One can speak of beauty without implying that anything ought to be beautiful. This perspective is summarized brilliantly by sociologists like Zygmunt Bauman, who observed that in postmodern times, ethics has largely been replaced by aesthetics. We ask if something is cool or compelling, not if it is good or right.
And this Nietzschean tradition is where modern philosophical relativism lives. The right and valid are known only in local space, defined by internal criteria, like culture or community standards.
And here is the political consequence. Defending an abstract, universal good like human rights or universal justice is no longer seen as beneficent. It's often immediately condemned as imperialism over the moral judgments of diverse communities. If everything is local, any attempt to impose a universal value is seen as an act of power and control.
And one of the most intellectually extreme outcomes of this shift is anti-realist naturalism. This perspective turns away from systematic ethics entirely, focusing on empirical emotions, intuition, desires, preferences, and it often claims a scientific basis for morality.
This claims to eliminate the long-standing philosophical fallacy of deriving ought from is by simply denying the distinction itself. They argue that ethics should have an empirical foundation, understandable in terms of measurable, vital human needs for safety, security, or belonging. We don't need moral philosophy. We need evolutionary biology and psychology.
Scientific naturalism even incorporates the acceptance of inherent uncertainty, citing things like Heisenberg's principle, suggesting that since the human condition is defined by fundamental limitedness, we must be agnostic about the moral order.
Right. If the universe is uncertain, then morality must be uncertain. Anti-realist naturalism is philosophical relativism in its ultimate extremity. It rejects the validity of both the metaphysical order and the Kantian rational order. It's a philosophy of a world weary of conflict and supremacy, seeking healing by removing the contentious universal language of morality altogether.
What a trajectory. We started with this absolute confidence in reason, which led us to cut freedom away from moral order, and that severance, pushed to its logical extreme, ended up destroying the moral order entirely, leaving us with either cold, context-free logic or subjective, localized feelings. So we're stuck in an intellectual dead end, trapped between context-free absolutism and subjective relativism. The source material is clear. If we want qualitative research to fulfill its emancipatory potential, we need a totally different ethics, one that moves beyond the ethics of individuated, detached reason.
We have to move beyond the traps of procedural relativism. Even when ethicists today try to combine components of rationalism like virtue, consequences, and prescriptions, they inevitably reduce ethics to a proceduralist and formalist enterprise. Utilitarianism, which is modernity's representative ethics, replaces deep metaphysical distinctions with the calculation of empirical quantities.
And utilitarianism appeals to institutions and policymakers because it offers the prospect of exact calculation of policy through rational choice theory. It makes moral issues look like discrete problems that are amenable to technical solutions, like cost-benefit analyses.
But the critique is devastating. This exactness only represents a semblance of validity by legislating intrinsic valuing out of existence. Utilitarianism can tell you it's efficient to lay off 100 people to save 1,000 jobs, but it cannot measure or protect the inherent human value of the jobs lost, only the quantifiable economic gain.
And we see this failure embodied physically in our current mechanisms for policing research, specifically in institutional review boards or IRBs and university codes of ethics. They embody that individualistic, utilitarian agenda.
They suffer from what Alfred North Whitehead famously called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. This means confusing methodological operations with normative morality. The moral domain becomes functionally equivalent to the epistemological domain.
So in practice, what does that confusion look like?
It means that sets of methodological operations, like filling out consent forms, assessing statistical risk, or promising anonymity, become the normative definition of ethical research. They are procedural rules, not moral insight. The source notes that IRBs become homogeneous closed systems that protect their institutional home rather than their research population.
A perfect negative example of this misplaced concreteness would be an IRB rejecting a genuinely community-driven research project, say, a community group wanting to study police interactions, because the methodology doesn't fit the standard risk assessment form. And in doing so, they're prioritizing the university's liability over the community's urgent need for emancipatory knowledge.
Precisely. They organized in scientific terms, and this confusion of categories is both illogical and ultimately banal. To escape this trap, we must construct research ethics on totally different grounds, turning the ethics of rationalism on its head. The ethics we need must be ontological, dealing with situated being, rather than modernity's morality, which is constrained strictly within epistemology.
This is the moment where we fully introduce the ethics of being. It moves beyond the idea that morality is something abstractly reasoned in a vacuum. It suggests that ethical principles must be historically embedded, situated within culture and history, which directly contradicts the absolutist, context-free foundations of the Western canon.
Morality is situated in human existence, not anchored in some Newtonian cosmology of unchanging logical laws. And the foundational concept here is the ontological linguistic definition of the human species.
That's a deep academic phrase. What does the ontological linguistic human mean for our understanding of ethics?
It means that humans are the one living species fundamentally constituted by language. The symbolic realm is intrinsic to us. We are dialogic agents within a language community. Language is not just a tool we use, it is the medium of our historical existence, situating our beingness in a world that is already meaningful upon our entering it, in the words of Hans Georg Gadamer.
Okay, so rationalism said the individual uses reason to construct meaning. The ethics of being says the individual enters a world where meaning, and therefore morality, is already communally constructed through language and history.
That is the crucial move. Rational calculation, impartial reflection, and technical problem solving, the cornerstones of the Enlightenment mind, are replaced with an account of human interactions that teach the good in everyday life. Morality is therefore fundamentally communal, conveyed through our communicative bonds about social well-being, tradition, and shared narrative.
This communal focus leads directly to community as the normative ideal. Contrary to Lockean dualism, which sees the individual as primary and self-sufficient, people in the ethics of being know themselves primarily as beings in relation.
Right. The ethics of being interlocks personal autonomy with communal well-being. It recognizes that true freedom requires a context of shared values and social support. Morally appropriate action intends community. The community itself is defined by Daniel Bell as a normative ideal, composed of those attachments one values, which define and condition one's well-being. Common moral values are intrinsically necessary for a community's existence and identity.
This radically changes the relationship between the researcher and the research, doesn't it? If the public sphere is a mosaic of particular communities, then the substantive understandings of the good that drive research problems must reflect the conceptions of the community, rather than merely the expertise of researchers or the demands of the state.
And this necessitates viewing researchers and subjects as co-participants in a common moral project. This collaborative research model, championed by scholars like Norman Denzin, is not just about giving participants a voice. It necessitates shared ownership of the research, community-based analyses, and an emancipatory commitment to social action.
So the researcher is responsible not to a distant academic discipline or their institution's liability forms, but to those they study, aligning research ethics with a politics of resistance, hope, and freedom. This moves research from extraction to mutual emancipation.
And this monumental shift in ontology also necessitates a corresponding radical shift in how we define justice. We must move away from modernity's dominant framework of right-order justice.
Let's clarify right-order justice. That framework, championed by thinkers from Locke to Rawls and Habermas, is typically procedural, right?
It is procedural and institutional. Justice is considered done when members receive the goods to which they have a right, and every right is conferred by institutions, such as the state or the legal system. The system determines the right order, and we ensure everyone follows the rules and receives their conferred due. John Rawls's theory of justice, for instance, relies on this unsubstantiated notion of a choosing self, making rational choices behind a veil of ignorance. And critics, notably Michael Sandel, point out that this framework ignores the deeply important constitutive aspects of community life.
So the radical alternative provided by the ethics of being is restorative justice. This flips the source of rights completely.
For restorative justice, receiving one's due arises from our intrinsic worthiness as Homo sapiens. This worth is non-negotiable. It is an inherent, unchangeable value. It is not a privilege conferred by legal mechanisms or a political system. If a legal system fails, our worth doesn't disappear.
So the universal generalization that torture of innocent humans is unjust doesn't arise because criminal law has established a specific right order that prohibits it. It arises from humanity's intrinsic, non-negotiable value.
Exactly. Intrinsic worth is ontologically prior to mechanisms of conferral. Restorative justice is the defining norm. Where that inherent worth has been violated or diminished through poverty, injustice, or bureaucratic indifference, we are under a moral obligation to restore it. This is the crucial way the ethics of being reintegrates ethics and politics, grounding itself in the idea that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice, as Martin Luther King Jr. stated.
That quote perfectly encapsulates the idea that justice isn't merely a rule book, which is right order, but a constant active movement toward restoring inherent human dignity, which is restorative. So we've traced this journey from absolute rationalism to moral relativism and found a path forward in the ethics of being. But let's look one last time at the current mechanisms, the codes of ethics and IRBs, that still police research. They embody that outdated individualistic utilitarian agenda.
And they suffer, as we discussed, from the foundational incoherence of the empiricist models Mill's progeny. The irony is staggering. Protecting and promoting individual autonomy was the philosophical rationale for value neutrality. Yet these empiricist models ultimately contradict the ideal of free rational beings by limiting their active involvement or by judging their self-understanding to be false because it's subjective.
Essentially, the instrumentalist system takes away what neutrality aims to protect: a community of free and equal rational beings legislating their own principles of conduct. The inability to incorporate the participant's own self-understanding renders the whole system inconsistent with the Enlightenment's own highest ideals of freedom.
And the social ontology of the ethics of being provides the only coherent escape from this contradiction because it reintegrates human life with the moral order. It acknowledges that human action and conceptions of the good are interactive, not separated by some objective fact-value split. Interpretation is a moral act.
This philosophical shift requires nothing less than a revolutionary social science. Qualitative research, freed from the cold constraints of neutrality and superficial instrumentalism, must dedicate itself to advancing social justice.
And this means research conceptualizations must be grounded in critical ethical challenges to social systems, offering active supports for egalitarian struggle, and promoting revolutionary ethical awareness and activism from within the context of community. The goal of research is no longer merely accurate description of a functional social order, but the disclosure of human communities as a normative moral ideal that demands restoration of worth.
In this new paradigm, the positivist worldview is intellectually turned completely upside down. The questions of method become secondary to the questions of paradigm, the foundational belief system that guides the investigator.
And that brings us to the final, provocative thought we want to leave you with from this deep dive. If we accept that restorative justice, based on intrinsic worth, is the true norm for human interaction and the foundation for the ethics of being, then how must qualitative research methodologies radically change? We have to ensure they serve the community in which they are carried out, working for their emancipation and restoration, rather than primarily serving the community of knowledge producers and policymakers who so often maintain the status quo. That fundamental shift from institutional protection to prioritizing intrinsic worth is the true challenge for the next generation of inquiry.